Chapter 2. Parallels between Eastern and Western philosophy. Gnosticism, the science of salvation. Religions and philosophies come into existence, unfold their teachings, attain their maximum sphere of influence, and then either diminish and fade away, or are subject to broad renovations and reforms. It is possible to construct a graph which shows clearly the parallels between the motions of ideas and the evolution of organic forms in nature. From the study of such a graph, if carefully prepared, a quantity of useful information can be gathered. Several interrelated factors influence the complicated course of a spiritual revelation. First of all, a major philosophical system nearly always originates in a period of moral or ethical confusion, resulting from a spreading revolt against some earlier school of thought that has lost its effectiveness. A new belief must also be placed in its proper setting involving the time factors and the environment in which some reformation is urgently required. It follows that in almost every instance, beliefs originate in a local need and therefore develop in the restricted atmosphere of a clan, tribe, or community. They must also be considered as the productions of emergencies. The gods long honored by a people have ceased to answer its prayers or have no longer bestowed protection against the enemy. On the philosophical level, the experiences of the community may have advanced the people until the beliefs of their ancestors are no longer satisfactory or applicable to existing conditions. A new teaching, in order to survive, must transcend the area, the time, and the conditions associated with its origin. A faith given to a people living in the desert must be acceptable to those who dwell in cities. It must extend its influence through the levels of society, finding enthusiastic exponents among farmers, merchants, professional persons, and aristocrats. If it cannot adapt itself to the needs of the many, its influence will always be restricted to the few, and as these die out, the doctrine itself must perish. There are also larger considerations. A teaching, to gain world prominence, must transcend barriers of language, the isolating factors of political systems, and find ways of supplanting older beliefs or forming a cooperative partnership with them. Having thus assured a large area of influence, it must cope with the factor of time, which in turn is the measure by which social change is weighed and estimated. As it is relatively impossible for any human being to foresee the mental, emotional, and physical conditions of his remote descendants, or estimate the problems that future ages must meet in order to survive, it is inevitable that men will outgrow the interpretations their forebears have placed upon spiritual and natural phenomena. Progress does not disturb facts, but it does require a new interpretation of the moral and ethical implications of realities universally accepted and respected. It is interesting to compare situations that arose almost simultaneously in the unfoldment of Eastern and Western civilization. For a long time it was assumed that the timing was coincidental, but it is now suspected that some direct contact between the two hemispheres contributed to the similarities that have so long disturbed scholars. In Western civilization, which still centered around the Mediterranean area, the first century of the Christian era has been so significant as to result in our calculation of historical sequences as before and after the beginning of the Christian era. Let us summarize briefly what may be termed the intellectual emergency. Greek philosophy had fallen into decline, and the Grecian states were under the dominion of Rome. Roman philosophy was a negligible factor, offering very little to satisfy the inner life of the Latin people. Egyptian learning had been so seriously debased that it was little more than an abject formalism, catering to the whims of Rome. The Jewish religion was under enormous pressure because the God of Israel had been unable to preserve the freedom of his people and had permitted the destruction of his temple in Jerusalem. Christianity was emerging, but at that time had very little general influence. It was one of those local beliefs that was tied too closely to the shores of Galilee to enjoy much respect from scholars or self-satisfied patricians. Primitive faiths on the borders of the Roman Empire exercised only a negligible influence, but the more advanced and stimulating concepts of the Persians were intriguing to the Roman legion. In various ways, systems of beliefs too old or too young to cope with the human tragedy that was being enacted in the centers of Western culture attempted to renovate or strengthen their teachings, making them more attractive to the multitude with its countless prejudices. Out of the collapse of the school of Athens came the Neoplatonists and Neopythagoreans of Greece, Rome, and North Africa. The Romans themselves began to produce a few idealistic leaders who sought to restore the sacred schools they had inherited from Greece and Egypt. The Roman situation found inspiration in Neoplatonism, the most able exponent of this system among the emperors being Julian the Apostate. Egypt was in the process of revising its own system and laying the foundations for that elusive cult which has survived to us as Hermeticism, which in turn gave rise to medieval alchemy. In the Judaic area, a forthright mysticism was evolving as a consolation in time of great sorrow. Here is the traditional source of the Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Formations, and the Sefer HaZohar, the Book of the Splendors. The Mishnah was taking precedence over the Torah, and after the diaspora, the children of Israel carried their mystical aspirations together with the strange spiritual sciences which they evolved throughout Europe and the Near East under the broad name of Kabbalism. Christianity, although comparatively young, sensed its own need almost immediately and rebuilt its foundations upon the ministry of St. Paul, who emphasized strongly the mystical experience of Christ as the spirit of life, hope, consolation, and resurrection in the heart of every true believer. Even this broad program, however, had one besetting weakness. Christianity had developed upon a level of simple needs, and naturally had little to offer to the philosopher, the scholar, and the sage. In order to solve this dilemma, the early church fathers condemned in general all branches of higher intellectualism, insisting that by simple faith alone salvation was possible. Several groups opposed this point of view, with the result that the early centuries of Christianity were plagued with schisms and heresies. On the fringe of Christianity, where it mingled its influence with Neoplatonism and the old sacerdotal mysteries of Egypt, there developed another remarkable pattern of heterodoxies. The most famous of these were the Syrian and the Egyptian Gnosis. Around the Gnosis, and intertwining with it at least to a degree, were the Manichaeans, Nestorians, Arianists, and pre-Islamic mystical associations of Arabia and Persia. It was all very complicated, but with the concept of a graph in mind, the broad trends are immediately clear. Western man had reached a point of no return in his journey from antiquity to modern times. The institutions he cherished were collapsing about him. He had to either reject his faith or reform it. As the human being is by nature religious and simply declines to exist in a society devoid of abstract ideals, he followed the most reasonable course. He reserved his old heroes, honored the sanctuaries of his ancient beliefs, but convinced himself that beneath the surface of his former theological acceptances there were esoteric truths, spiritual laws, transcendental arts, and mystical forms of wisdom, and the time had come for these to be revealed. Having made his bridge, and having escaped in this way from the abstract and arbitrary boundaries of orthodoxy, he came into possession of an evolving religion, a faith that grew with him and could therefore be enthusiastically bestowed upon future ages. Thus came the days of the great evangelisms. Now let us turn our attention for a moment to conditions in Asia, using the same date line, the beginning of the Christian era. Everywhere on this vast eastern continent, religions and philosophies were in trouble. Hinduism, far the oldest, was still staggering under the impact of Buddhism. From his early discourses, it is evident that Buddha actually regarded himself as a reformer of Hinduism, which was beginning to close in on the Buddhist schools. Furthermore, the old gods of India were more glamorous than the quiet, unworldly arhats who preached the way of salvation taught by the light of Asia. These arhats were also under difficulties. In the 600 years after the death of Buddha, the Sangha, or the Brotherhood, had been confronted with numerous obstacles and had slowly lost the tremendous impulse bestowed upon it by the personal life and teachings of Gautama Buddha. Councils had become necessary, and the Sangha had taken refuge under the protection of benevolent monarchs and princes. It was generally assumed that Buddhism was destined to slowly fade away. Its moral code was too severe, and not many were to be found who would renounce wealth, family, social position, and even the scanty comforts of life to wander as homeless beggars along the rough roads and paths of Bengal. Buddhism had become a more or less exclusive order of monks, and like most such monastic groups, had slight hope of survival, and even less hope of exercising a profound influence upon the moral life of Asia. Hindu scholarship was riddled with skepticism, and strong traces of pre-scientific materialism were becoming evident. The various schools had little in common, and the only answer was the rise of some mystical tradition. This need was met by the gradual unfoldment of yoga and Vedanta philosophy. China was in a sad way both politically and religiously. There was no such empire as we generally visualize when we think of the vast area of Chinese influence. There was constant warfare and bickering, rivalry of princes, and a continuing exploitation of the common people. Taoism, the mystical philosophy of Lao Tzu, one of the most advanced systems ever devised by the human mind, had fallen into a kind of ceremonial magic, dealing in miracles, trying to perpetuate itself by offering more and more of consolation and less constructive instruction. Confucianism was not much better off. The master himself died disillusioned and convinced that his ideals could not survive. They did live, but gradually fell into the keeping of a group of aristocratic intellectuals. By degree, Confucianism was used to bolster up the aristocracy and protect it from the righteous indignation of the proletariat. Wherever Confucianism gained ascendancy, it attacked all liberalism. While it gave China a magnificent concept of life, it was never able to gain a sufficient support among leaders free from self-interest. The Near East had not yet felt the impact of Muhammad, and most of its schools of thought were drifting into compromise and exploitation.